Hi, I'm Curtis Doebbler, Research Professor of Law at the University of Makeni in Sierra Leone, and this is a short introduction to the environment and trade and energy for the course on international environmental and climate change law. How are the environment and trade and energy related? Well, this triangular relationship is perhaps a natural relationship. The environment, planet Earth, or Mother Earth, as the indigenous people called it, this is a place where we live. Trade is how we interact with each other to acquire particularly material things that we want, but often that we need, such as food, water, medical care, social welfare, housing. And energy is how we produce the goods that we use to interact and sometimes use to obtain these four things that I've just mentioned. So there is a natural interaction between the environment, trade, and energy production. Let's start with energy. Since we've talked about the protection of the environment, we know that there are some basic guidelines for protecting the environment that have been established by the international community, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on the Prevention of Desertification, declarations on deforestation to try to prevent deforestation, and the Biodiversity Convention to try to prevent the depletion of biodiversity. Well, these are some of the things that environmental law tries to protect. And as we also know, there are some things that international human rights law tries to protect that are perhaps the reason why environmental law, at least through its anthropogenic perspective, tries to protect Mother Earth. And those are, for example, the right to food, the right to water, the right to health care, the right to an adequate standard of living. These are all human rights that more than 2/3 of the international community have agreed to, more than 3/4 of the international community have agreed to as rights that every individual is entitled to. In Africa, many of these rights are not only individual rights, but also group rights or people's rights. In Sierra Leone, these are rights by virtue of your constitution, often because the Sierra Leone government has ratified the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And as we've seen, they are party to several environmental treaties that protect the environment, again through this anthropogenic focus on protecting it for human beings. But energy production. Well, energy is something that is produced by countries that help us to then produce goods that we can trade. But energy production, sometimes the source of energy itself is a good that is traded. Well, what's the problem then? Well, there isn't really a problem, except that many of the materials we use to produce energy also harm the environment. Perhaps the best example is brown coal, of which Australia is the largest producer, but brown coal is one of the most polluting sources of energy. But a more commonly cited form of energy material or source of energy is the fossil fuel of oil, which is used to make the benzene or petrol that you use, the gasoline that you use in your car, or to run a generator. So these are sources of energy, raw material sources of energy that also harm the environment. That is why there has been a movement, a commitment to try to green our economies, which means to try to move from the production of energy through polluting forms of energy to less polluting forms of energy, or even green forms of energy. Some of these less polluting forms of energy are solar energy. geothermal heating and cooling sources, hydroelectric energy, and there's some new sources of energy like fission that are trying to create a fission and fusion nuclear reactors that provide energy that can possibly be a source of energy, but it's not clear yet whether it's too dangerous or whether it's more polluting than the sources of energy we have today. And several countries have decided that they will not use those, or they will start to tune down their use of those, as have countries that use coal and petrol. So the relationship between the environment and energy is one based on the fact that energy is needed for the production of goods for trade. So that's part of the puzzle, the triangle, but it also harms the environment. So energy's relationship to the environment is that it can be harmful. It doesn't have to be, but can be because of the raw resources we use to produce energy. And in relation to trade, it can help us to produce trade, but again, with the possible harmful effect on the environment. For that reason, some of the instruments that we have already looked at, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, calls for states to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels, if you will, but not directly. It does it by saying they should reduce the production of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, there are different ways to do that. You could take the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. You could also prevent putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. States are not told how to do that. They are merely told that they should achieve the goal of preventing a harmful level of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that is why energy producers continue to say, well, we can still produce energy cleanly, sometimes by using sinks to take the polluting part, if you will, the excess greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and sometimes by converting to energy that doesn't produce greenhouse gases, such as solar or hydroelectric energy. So energy is extremely important, and we have a treaty based or that looks at how we produce energy, one that is predominantly influenced by developed countries, that tries to support the continued production of energy through raw materials, although it tries to move it towards a more sustainable future. And this is called the Energy Charter. The Energy Charter is a treaty that tells states that they should try to ensure energy that is sustainable, which means essentially that they should green their economies. Now that's fine, but that doesn't work so well for developing countries because they don't have the resources to green their economies. And then that takes us a little bit to the relationship between trade and energy and trade and the environment. Because if you remember, I said trade is a way that we try to acquire from each other the resources we need to live and sometimes that we want to live. Today, it is not balanced. The theory behind international trade by economists like Olin is that if countries trade together, that they will balance themselves out and everybody will get what they need. Well, that's not how it's worked. In fact, developed countries continue to get more than they need, while developing countries continue to get less than they need. And as I mentioned in this class several times, the gap between developed countries and developing countries has increased rather than decreased since 1945 when the United Nations was created. But one of the bodies created within the United Nations that was supposed to balance out or make more equitable development and trade is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD as it is formally usually known. I've asked you to read the 2001 UNCTAD report on trade and development. It's a report that they come out with every year that looks at trade and development from a developing country perspective, and particularly of concern to least developed countries, of which Sierra Leone is one. It raises several issues. First, let us remember that some of these things that developing countries trade for are necessities, like food, access to food. It's not so much a question of production of food, but often in developing countries, people cannot access food because they cannot afford it. So food, water, which is now becoming more commoditized, in other words, sold, and is not always affordable by people in developing countries. Healthcare and social welfare. These are all items that people need. They are necessities of life. They are also items that need to be provided even within the context of an environment. So there's a tension there. How do we ensure these things for people without harming our environment? Trade plays a big role in that today. Trade plays a role in that because increasingly we are privatizing these mechanisms. And even when they're not privatized, developed states are using market mechanisms to deal with developing countries. As most of you know, in Sierra Leone and in almost all least developed countries, healthcare is provided predominantly by the state. Social welfare is sometimes provided by public means. Often these means in developed countries are a mix of public and private means, and we see during the pandemic an interesting move by many developed countries back to public means. Yet at the same time, these same developed countries have deprived developing countries of some of these same means. And I want to just point out some of the ways this has been done. And you could say generally by public debt, and by exploitation of resources, and by denial of the funds to adequately adapt to climate change and to adequately access food. But that's very general. How have they done that in practice? Well, probably the most striking is by the failure to provide ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, which sounds like a gift, assistance, but it is actually an obligation states have undertaken. In 1970, developed states agreed to provide 0.7% of their gross domestic product to overseas development aid. They haven't done that. They haven't achieved even half that. And only about 6 or 7 states have ever achieved that goal of 0.7% of their gross domestic product. Instead, today, and they agreed to do that by 1975, and they said at the time, if we can't do it by 1975, at the very, very latest, we'll do it by 1980. Today, they're halfway there. And this is, 40 years after that. Today, instead of being 0.7, it's about 0.33. An example of how developed states have failed to provide adequate assistance is the climate change regime. In international climate change law, we have set up several mechanisms where states have undertaken, not in a legally binding way, but through what I would suggest could be legally binding through unilateral undertakings by the states at the senior level of states to provide $100 billion a year. They said they'd do that by 2020. Now they've said, well, we haven't met that, but we'll do it by 2025. Let's see if they meet that. Moreover, when they said that, it was understood by developing states that said this, that most of that would be grants, would be money provided to these states to be able to adapt and take some mitigation action on climate change. In fact, most of that money is loans, which actually means that the states giving it or the private entities in those states giving it earn money. Well, this has just been a very quick sort of overview of the relationship between environment, trade, and energy. And we'll talk about this more in class next week on the 7th of January. Hope to see you all.